Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 3 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Carolina Hurricanes and lost by a score of 5-1. We weren't entirely sure what type of performance we were going to end up getting from the Sharks here tonight, because they've already played 2 games this season, and while the results of those games were very similar, the way that they played out could not be any more different. Game 1, the Sharks went up against the Golden Knights and actually went toe-to-toe with a very good Vegas team. Had they actually managed to close out that game with a victory, it would have been extremely well deserved. But then a couple of nights later, they went up against a more middle of the pack Anaheim Ducks squad and ended up getting completely crushed. Yes, the score appeared close, but that was really only because the Ducks goaltender Peter Mrazek had a really bad night between the pipes. Otherwise, San Jose could not handle what the Ducks were bringing forward. And so here in this game against Carolina, would we get a team that was capable of absorbing the pressure against even some of the best squads in the NHL, or would we get the one that would fold at the slightest sign of pressure? And unfortunately, we ended up getting more so of the latter, but it didn't actually start out that way, because in the first period, San Jose actually looked pretty good. Yes, on the scoreboard here, not only is it a 0-0 game, but the Sharks are actually outshot by a 2-1 margin. I believe it was 15-7 in favor of Carolina, but it is very important to remember that the Hurricanes are a heavy volume shooting team. They will fire pucks at the net from pretty much every single possible angle, even if it is an incredibly low danger opportunity. Most teams have actually moved away from this strategy in recent years. Not Carolina, however. They do it every single season and they manage to have success, so why change a winning formula, at least in the regular season? And so while they did have 15 shots here, very, very few of them were actually of the high or even medium danger variety. Maybe a couple of close calls there, but San Jose, with their just 7 shots, had multiple good chances to actually get this puck past an inexperienced goaltender in net for the Hurricanes. It just nothing quite completed, and so it was 0-0 after 20 minutes. But I don't think the Sharks were too disappointed with how this game started. It was in the second period where things started to go downhill. First of all, the Sharks trailed for the first time this season when Walker scored to make it 1-0 Carolina, but then Eklund tied it up at 1-1. However, at that point, Carolina took back the lead, and unlike San Jose, they were actually able to hold on to it as Carrier scores to make it 2-1 and then Robinson scores to make it 3-1 by the end of the second period. However, if the second period was more of a kind of middle of the pack type of performance here from the Sharks where things were obviously outplayed, but it was at least somewhat close, it was the third period where the wheels came off completely. Not only were the Sharks outplayed, not only were the Sharks outscored as Gostisbehere and Blake added more goals here, but San Jose failed to generate even a single shot on goal over the course of this entire 20-minute period. That is despite being the home team. That is despite being the score effects beneficiaries here, since they are the trailing team in this third period. They get nothing going for themselves, and so this game ends up ending with a whimper as the Sharks get their first regulation loss of the year and extend their season-opening losing streak to 3. Obviously, still, this is a far cry from the 9 games they lost to open last year and the 11 they lost to the year before that, but it'll catch up pretty quickly, and so the Sharks will want to try and get this victory much more sooner rather than later here, so it doesn't begin to pile up and maybe ruin the morale in such an early part of the season. When we go to now talking about the players, before we get into the ones that actually played in this game here tonight, we must once again start with those that did not. Remaining on the sidelines for a second straight game was none other than Shakir Mukhamadullin, and he is actually joined by Colin Graf. And it doesn't really take a rocket scientist to figure out what these two players actually have in common. They are both young guys who are looking to make their full-time sort of debuts here in the NHL with the San Jose Sharks, and so it does not really come as a surprise that Graf is the player taken out of the lineup in favor of integrating in Michael Misa. And it goes back to a quote from yesterday that I found completely laughable from Ryan Warsofsky in a sad sort of way, because he was asked about the Sharks' defensive situation, but it does apply to the forwards as well, because he mentioned that the Sharks have 8 NHL-capable defensemen, all of which could play on any given night, but he goes on to say that he doesn't care, he being Warsofsky, he doesn't care if a player is a rookie or or if they are a 15-year NHL veteran. He just wants to play the player who gives the Sharks the best chance of winning on any given night. And obviously this is just not true. That's not to say that Warsofsky is a liar, because I do think he is being truthful in this scenario. The thing is that Ryan Warsofsky very clearly overvalues experience in terms of how it leads to winning games in the NHL, which is to say that I don't believe he is playing guys like Leddy and Klingberg over Shaquille Mukhamadullin simply because they are veterans, but that he believes they give the Sharks a better chance of winning games because of the experience that they have. Hopefully that difference does come across here. So it is technically true what Warsofsky is saying, but it obviously doesn't come across that way, which is what makes this a very laughable quote here, because every indication thus far this season proves very much the opposite. Just go back to Game 1. Mukhamadullin did start this year playing in the NHL with the San Jose Sharks. He was dressed for that first game against Vegas, and it was a bit of a rough start for him. Those first couple of shifts didn't go his way, and of course he ends up picking up a couple of penalties there, but by the end he did manage to bring it back and finished with maybe like a 5-on-10, perhaps 4-on-10 type of performance. Obviously not particularly good, but he wasn't the worst defenseman that night for the Sharks. However, for the following game against Anaheim, he ends up getting sat, getting healthy scratched. It was a move that I disagreed with, but at the very least it set a standard for the Sharks defensive core, that if they were going to have these 8 D-man in the NHL, that they were going to be in and out based on who was not playing well. But then in that game against Anaheim, we saw Nick Leddy and John Klingberg put up absolutely terrible performances. Not 5-on-10 or 4-on-10 like Mukhamadullin against Vegas, not even 1-on-10. We would have to actually go into the negative numbers to find the appropriate score to give them for that game. That's how bad it was. Probably about a negative 10-on-10 type of performance, to the point where if we were truly sticking to that standard set after the first game, both Leddy and Klingberg should be benched for the following night. And lo and behold, here against Carolina, they are both in the lineup. Now I can sort of understand it in the case of John Klingberg, because as bad as he definitely was against Anaheim, he does still provide a little bit of value to this Sharks lineup coming into this game. San Jose's power play was 3 for 8. Now that is heavily propped up by the fact that the Sharks have had a couple of 5-on-3 goals this season, and so when it comes to their 5-on-4 play, the jury is still out. But Klingberg is their top guy on that top power play unit, and so really the lesson from those first couple of games more so was that Klingberg is not someone who should be on your top pairing, is not someone who should be on the penalty kill. Now should Warsofsky be having to learn this lesson about a player who has been a known quantity in the NHL for many years? Probably not, but I could see a world where you have him still in that lineup on a third pairing playing much more sheltered minutes. But with Nick Leddy, the logic doesn't really follow, because he is a player who's not really providing much to this lineup. What does Nick Leddy truly do that is actually superior to what Mukhamadullin can actually bring on any given night? Is Nick Leddy far better defensively or offensively or anything of that nature? No, not really at all. And the one major advantage that Mukhamadullin does have is that he is actually a future part of this team, something that Nick Leddy definitely is not. It is just very strange that after a horrible outing against Anaheim, that Leddy would be prioritized and be given this chance of redemption. I thought that the Sharks had, certain priorities coming into this season. Yes, it was a certain case of trying to be better, but also important to try and get the young players into a good spot. Celebrini and Smith having a good sophomore year, Misa and Dickinson having a good rookie year, Mukhamadullin and Graf being integrated into the lineup. I didn't think one of the Sharks' top priorities was to rehabilitate Nick Leddy's image here in the NHL, and yet for whatever reason, he is being made the most important player on this team. I just don't really understand the perspective. The only thing that really stands out is trying to kind of raise his trade value, I guess. It was the same logic that has been used for many different players that the Sharks have had over the past few years, but it is much more in the same category as like a Jan Ruda, which is to say that Nick Leddy was literally on waivers just a few months ago from a playoff team that was more of a bubble squad like the St. Louis Blues. Nick Leddy is a maybe at best 6th defenseman, but likely more so a 7th defenseman who is making $4 million. there is not a playoff team here who is going to actually want to take on that contract unless Leddy is able to turn things around so considerably that he actually ends up being more of an attractive option. But the likelihood of that happening is very low, and more so, he'll probably end up going the way of Jan Ruda, where similar things were said about him last year, and that's why he had to be playing in every single game. Jan Ruda did not get traded at the deadline, though admittedly he was injured for that, but more notably, he didn't even sign a contract this offseason with an NHL team, instead going overseas because all teams decided to pass on him. I would not be surprised if the similar thing happens with Leddy in this upcoming offseason as well. So at best, maybe you are able to get his trade value up to a point where you can get like a conditional 5th round pick or something along those lines to be able to get rid of him. But are we really going to trade and sacrifice this important development season for Shakir Mukhamadullin, a contract year, by the way, for him, and so that kind of adds insult to injury? Are we really going to sacrifice that year for Mukhamadullin so that the Sharks maybe can get a conditional 5th round pick from like the Colorado Avalanche? It just doesn't make any sort of sense to me whatsoever. But now that we've already spent about half this video on Nick Leddy, let's move on to the players who actually did play here. The big news was that the San Jose Sharks, well, actually the big news is more so that Mukhamadullin and Graf sat out, but obviously otherwise, some other news for this game was that the Sharks did change up their top 3 lines quite considerably here tonight. On this first line, we have Celebrini, Eklund, and Toffoli reuniting together. That 70s line that we did see a good amount last year. The big thing there is that no more Celebrini and Smith duo. I did predict that these two players would get separated at some point this season, but I definitely didn't think it would happen this early on. But I don't actually necessarily blame Warsofsky for going for this look. You're trying to get yourself a little bit more familiarity here to try and get this victory off the ground, and yet it doesn't quite work out. We'll start off with Celebrini, who has had many flashes of brilliance over the first 3 games of this season. It happened against Vegas, against Anaheim, and here tonight against Carolina. There are certain shifts where he comes out and he looks like easily the best player on the ice, and he's just skating through multiple guys, and the only way to stop him is actually by just taking a penalty, basically. He's drawn a penalty in every single game thus far this season. But the moments and the shifts where this happens are a little bit too far in between. It just isn't as consistent as you would like for Celebrini. The thing is that the bar is quite high for this player. The expectations on his shoulders are insane. Not only is he viewed as the future face of this franchise, many people even view him as the future face of the NHL as a whole. And so those are some pretty big shoes to fill, and I don't want to necessarily say that the pressure is getting to him in that case, but I do wonder perhaps if actually what has transpired in training camp could perhaps be affecting his start of this year, because as we know, he sat out a decent chunk of the training camp and preseason to an undisclosed illness/injury, whatever the case may be. Pretty slow start, not maybe able to get as much of his conditioning up as he would like, only managed to play that single preseason game before the year began against the Utah Mammoth, and so perhaps that has affected how this season has started out for him. Still, he had 3 assists over the course of these 3 games, but obviously you are expecting a little bit more from him. When it comes to his 2 line mates, Toffoli and Eklund, Toffoli, I wasn't hugely impressed with him in this game. There were like a couple of decent opportunities on like Sharks power plays, I guess, but when it came to his even strength play, really not much doing there. Eklund does score the only goal for the San Jose Sharks in this game, which was quite nice to see. He's been pretty close to some chances, not necessarily goal-wise, but at least point-wise over these first couple of games. Manages to sneak this one through the 5-hole, but otherwise it's not as though Eklund was fantastic here tonight, and this was just a general theme for the team as a whole in this game. A lot of quiet nights from a lot of their forwards, because just not much was happening for a good 30 to 40 minutes of this 60 minutes game. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, here we have Wenberg and Smith, and they are actually joined by Jeff Skinner. So Smith gets bumped off the first line, Skinner gets promoted from the third to the second, and notably about Jeff Skinner, probably the Sharks' best player of the game. Had like a good half of their high danger opportunities, a lot of them just created by his own hard work in either the defensive zone or the offensive zone. In fact, you could argue that Skinner has been one of, if not the best forward for the San Jose Sharks in this entire season thus far. He has looked really kind of rejuvenated and energized thus far this season, really trying to prove a point not just to the San Jose Sharks squad, but to every single team around the NHL as being an attractive trade option a few months from now. And so it is nice to see him get that promotion, and I would not even be remotely surprised if that promotion actually continues and that we could see him on the first line with Celebrini by the very next game on Friday against the Utah Mammoth. And that wouldn't even necessarily be so much to try and get Skinner to be playing with Celebrini, but it would even feel like trying to get Celebrini to play with Jeff Skinner, because Skinner is really rolling right now, and that could certainly help Celebrini out in this top line center position. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Skinner get bumped up. When it comes to the two other players on this line, they had some okay success. Wenberg and Smith did. They were all right, and you could certainly say that this was the best line of the night for the San Jose Sharks, but that's really just not saying much. Pretty quiet from both of them. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, here we did have the inclusion of Michael Misa for the first time this season. As I already mentioned, it was Colin Graf who stepped out of the lineup. It's still, crazy to me that is actually a decision, because Colin Graf has actually looked rather good and was a part of the best line for the San Jose Sharks over the first couple of games of Graf, Skinner, and Dellandrea. So to me, it seems as though it would be much more obvious to be removing one of these fourth liners in either Barclay Goodrow or Ryan Reeves. In fact, Graf is a type of player who you absolutely could drop down to the fourth line, and he would have likely an immense amount of success there. And even just the one-to-one swap with Barclay Goodrow would make a ton of sense for the Sharks. Colin Graf is better offensively, definitely has much more of a spark, and playing with Adam Gaudette, that could actually allow him to get rolling more. He is better defensively, as much as Barclay Goodrow loves to ride the coattails of what he was capable of doing with the Tampa Bay Lightning 5 years ago, and as much as Warsofsky continues to believe that he is capable of doing this, that is no longer the case. And even on the penalty kill, which is the major advantage that Barclay Goodrow has. He's actually a pretty good penalty killer. Colin Graf is no slouch in that area either. Whether or not he is better than Goodrow on the penalty kill, that's a different question, but it is close enough that the other advantages that Graf gives should give him priority in this lineup. And as we know, Goodrow is never stepping out of this lineup. He's never going to be a healthy scratch. It would take an injury for him to not play here, and so that's just completely off the table in general. And so we may very well see swaps of Misa and Graf through this lineup, or perhaps Misa and Kurashev in this lineup throughout this season, because this fourth line seems to be untouchable. Now, when it comes to Misa's actual performance in this game, I was actually rather impressed. Obviously it wasn't fantastic because the night as a whole for the Sharks was quite bad, but I think Misa showed a decent amount of promise. The big thing that I had said throughout the entire preseason, and now with having him played his first NHL game, I stick with that, is that he is further along right now than Will Smith was last season at this same time. Smith looked pretty much completely lost on the ice in early October. Misa, though, decent positioning. I thought he made some okay plays. There were still some issues, of course, as you would expect from an 18-year-old. Playing in a game against a very good team like the Carolina Hurricanes, still needs to be able to keep his stick on the ice, still needs a little bit more of that confidence and killer instinct to actually be able to contribute offensively, but there were certainly some positive signs. I know some people have been a little bit down on Misa. They talk about through the preseason how he was somewhat quiet in terms of offensive production, but I think a lot of the good fundamentals are there, and if he's actually given a chance of playing games here in the NHL, which should be the case, it feels as though he is much closer to that kind of breakout moment than Smith was. Smith took a good 3 months to actually get to that point. If Misa could actually get consistent games, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened much sooner. The problem is, of course, whether or not Misa will actually get those consistent games. Already it took until the third game of the year for him to even get into the lineup, and Warsofsky's justification was that Carolina is a predictable team, which will make it a bit more safe for Misa to slide in because he could be a bit more confident about what's going on the ice. But yes, that is sort of true, but at the same time, as I mentioned, Carolina is one of the most hard-working teams in the entire league. They play a very fast game, not in terms of skating speed, but just there's always going to be a man on you at every single moment, and so you have to make extremely quick plays. And one of the major criticisms of young players usually is that they struggle to adjust to the pace of the NHL game. And Carolina is one of the highest paced teams in the entire league. It is why they are able to so often dominate in the regular season, because most teams aren't able to play at such a consistently high level like Rod Brind'Amour is able to get out of this Hurricanes team. And so this was still not really a positive team. This was not an easy matchup for Michael Misa. I don't think that this was necessarily going to be any better or worse than having him play his first game against Anaheim or having him play his first game against Vegas. He should have been in the lineup earlier, and having this sort of idea and excuse that, oh, well, we wanted him against Carolina because it was just going to be an easier time is very, very far from the truth. But at least he did have a decent night. When it comes to his two line partners, we have Dellandrea, who was okay-ish. There was an attempt at forechecking, but the Sharks just couldn't really get much going throughout this game, so not exactly amazing or anything. Quiet night as usual. Kurashev had an even more particularly quiet night. I noticed him a couple of times in the first period making some plays here on this line, but from the second period onward, it felt as though you basically just didn't notice him at all on the ice. So while it was mostly quiet for a lot of players, particularly quiet for him. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, Gaudreau, Gaudette, Ryan Reeves, it's this fourth line. They've been together for 3 games now. Gaudreau is going to do exactly what you expect from Barclay Goodrow. Give you 20% play at even strength, be an okay penalty killer, and we just have to accept that, unfortunately. Ryan Reeves, pretty similar. He actually got more ice time than usual here tonight, as the Sharks were very clearly looking for a spark that Reeves was unable to deliver. Not blaming him on that or anything. It's just nothing seemed to be able to spark this team here tonight. And then Gaudette did actually have a chance or two in this game, but couldn't quite bury it there. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, we of course have the top pairing that must feature Nick Leddy because he can do no wrong, and he is joined by Timothy Liljegren. Now I will say, obviously I'd spent a lot of time already in this video discussing Leddy, and it would seem rather mean or critical of what I ended up saying, but I will say for tonight, Nick Leddy actually looked pretty good. His first period, he was probably the best defenseman on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. He kind of fell off as the game wore on, as did the entire team, and so in the second and in particular the third period, he went back to some of the struggles we were seeing against Anaheim. But for a brief moment in that first period, I was very impressed with the type of redemption that he was able to have, but it doesn't really defeat the point that I was making earlier on in this video, is that why is Nick Leddy being put into the position to even have this kind of redemption moment when a player like Mukhamadullin is benched 2 games in a row despite being significantly more valuable for this franchise moving forward? When it comes to Timothy Liljegren, he had a night that was certainly not the worst defenseman on the ice, but obviously he had his struggles, and quite considerably, in the third period. This is also going to be a theme for the entirety of this blue line core. Just as the forwards had a very quiet night, the defense, the problem is that if the defense has a quiet night, that usually means the other team is scoring a lot of goals, and so it ends up reflecting quite poorly onto them, and Liljegren does not really manage to escape that. On the Sharks' second pairing here, we have Ferraro and Orlov. Orlov was an interesting player to watch here because he is going up against his former team. Now, sometimes when a player goes up against their former team, it's not really a notable situation. This usually happens when the kind of departure is quite amicable. For instance, the Sharks traded away Brent Burns to give him a chance at a Stanley Cup. There were no hard feelings there, and so when Brent Burns returned back to San Jose for his first game a couple of years ago, it didn't feel like a revenge tour or anything like that. It was just a nice moment. But with Orlov, we know that there was a little bit of unhappiness with how he was treated and the role that he played with the Carolina Hurricanes, in particular this past season, and when that happens, you usually expect a player to really turn it on in their first matchup against their former team. We, for instance, saw that from Timothy Liljegren going up against the Toronto Maple Leafs last year. Those were literally his 2 best games of the entire season. And Orlov, he came out clearly looking to make an impact. He was trying very hard, at times too hard, and it kind of bit him a little bit. Some mistakes being made because he's just attempting to make that big impact, especially since the rest of the Sharks team was just sort of flailing behind him. He ended up going a little bit too far at times, but in the end, he probably ended up being generally over the course of 60 minutes, the best defenseman on the ice for the Sharks. Leddy had him beat in the first, but it didn't hold up. So Orlov against his former team doesn't quite get the victory that he wanted, but at least he looked serviceable-ish. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I thought Ferraro, he had his moments where I thought he looked all right, but as we know, Ferraro, a big weakness of his is when he is hemmed into his own zone, he has basically zero ability of actually clearing it out. And since the Sharks were in their defensive zone for basically an entire 30-40 minutes of this 60-minute game, that really ended up exposing Mario Ferraro. So there were some okay moments, but more often than not, just kind of bad. And then we get to the Sharks' third defensive pairing. Here we have Sam Dickinson and John Klingberg. And we'll have to start off with Sam Dickinson, who had a very, very rough night. Quite unfortunate to see, because the previous game against Anaheim, he was one of the only defensemen who at least looked remotely decent in that game. Obviously, Klingberg and Leddy were just absolutely awful. And so it was nice to see Dickinson get a second straight game in the lineup, even if it was the cost of having Mukhamadullin sit out yet again. And I was hopeful that he'd be able to get increased minutes, but I actually don't even necessarily blame Warsofsky that much for having him not play as much time on ice, because he was definitely a liability a lot of the times. His major issue here tonight, of course, coming in the defensive zone. It reminded me a lot of watching Jack Thompson play, actually. The big issue I found with Thompson is that he would constantly overthink things. He would be in certain positions on the ice, and you could see him processing a certain play, or wherever the puck was, and thinking about, okay, where do I need to go next? Where do I need to be able to actually complete, this breakout or something like that. So if the puck is being fought for in the corner, you could see kind of the gears turning in Jack Thompson's head to decide what he needed to do. And it was very similar here tonight with Sam Dickinson. There were multiple moments where you could kind of see the processing taking place, and then suddenly a switch gets flipped and he darts towards one particular area of the ice. And the problem with that is that hockey moves at such a fast pace that if you're actually having to think and process about what you need to be doing on the ice, you're already going to be behind, you're already going to be making mistakes and be out of position, and that is a very real problem here. It is what's tough about actually coaching defensemen and young defensemen in the NHL, is because you want to be able to try and tell them, okay, if the puck, is going low to high, I need you to challenge the puck carrier, whatever the case may be, whatever play you might want to go for. If you're trying to get them to do that, they're going to have to think about doing it in the moment, not going to be playing instinctually, and as such, they're going to be a step behind, and that was the case very much so for Sam Dickinson here tonight. So it's kind of about managing how much sort of room and how much of a loosened leash you're going to give him, while also trying to keep him reined in a little bit and playing the right way. So definitely a very tough night for Sam Dickinson, a lot of different mistakes being made. I suspect that he probably won't be in the lineup for the very next game. I think he probably should be, just to be, given the chance to redeem himself, just as Nick Leddy got here tonight. But knowing Ryan Warsofsky, he's probably the guy who steps out of the lineup in favor of Shakir Mukhamadullin, so that we can keep the proper amount of young players on this roster. But obviously Dickinson, from an individual standpoint, struggled immensely here tonight, but let's not let off his defensive partner off the hook. John Klingberg, who was already terrible against the Anaheim Ducks, once again had a very, very bad night. I mentioned earlier on that you kind of do sort of want Klingberg still in the lineup because of the value that he can provide, at the very least on the power play. But I also just spent the last 3 weeks basically campaigning against having Nick Leddy and John Klingberg on the same pairing, because of the fact that they are both offensively minded players who don't actually defend in their own zone very well. And so then the answer of separating those two players to then have Klingberg and Dickinson together is just an absolute recipe for disaster. And while I certainly don't put the blame onto Klingberg as to why Dickinson played well or played poorly, as he was individually quite bad himself, but this is an anchor weighing down this bottom pairing. And I think Warsofsky is going to end up having to make some really, really tough decisions. If Klingberg can't even be trusted in a sheltered third pairing role, can he be a player that the Sharks actually play every single night? This team does not have a good enough 5 defenseman core to actually be able to have Klingberg play very, very limited minutes just on the power play. They need a full-on 6 defenseman group, and Klingberg just doesn't really seem to be able to keep up at this NHL level currently. Obviously, that's still very, very early, and with him being a veteran, he's going to have about 20,000 lives throughout this season, but he's starting to lose a lot of them over the course of these first couple games. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender, Nedeljkovic. It was time for redemption, I guess you could say, after that first game against Vegas, where he played very well for the first 58 or so minutes, but then made a mistake with that bouncing puck, and then a mistake with that failed play out of his net at the blue line that led to the Sharks losing that game in overtime. Here tonight, Nedeljkovic it was unfortunately another rough outing, putting the Sharks in a bit of an awkward position. I know a lot of people will look at this game and say, well, the Sharks played poorly. We can't blame the goaltender here. And it's not as though if Nedeljkovic was absolutely stellar that the Sharks would have ended up winning this game. But you take a look at the 5 goals that he let in. The second one and the fourth one, he didn't really have much of a chance on. But this 5th goal, he completely loses track of the puck, which should never really happen, just drops focus and ends up letting in a one-timer from the point with basically no traffic. This first goal from Walker is also a one-timer from the point with very little traffic in front, at least relative to what you usually expect in the NHL. And even this third goal from Robinson, while this is technically like a partial breakaway, it is one that you hope Nedeljkovic will be able to make a save on based on how weak of that goal actually ended up being. And so the reason I say that this is a bit of a problem now for the Sharks is that if Nedeljkovic is kind of in an awkward headspace because of what happened in that first game, and Askarov is in a bit of an awkward headspace with what happened in that second game, who's really the goaltender for the San Jose Sharks to go with? Like, obviously they're going to continue going back and forth, especially since their next set of games is on a back-to-back, but neither of them is inspiring a ton of confidence currently. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday, where they'll be taking on the Utah Mammoth. A brief stint on the road before they end up returning home briefly with a game against Pittsburgh. Hopefully the Sharks, at least in one of those 2 games, will be able to pick up a victory. Class dismissed.